we're going to give a little update on home gardening and trail and some of the work that we've been doing. Everyone always asks, should I garden? Should I not garden? Well, we want to give you some, we got lots of questions. We want to give you some tips and advice and some of our findings. I'd like to review a little bit about what affects lead in produce. Note that we're going to use PB instead of the word lead, just so that people aren't confused with the word lead. So that's used consistently through this presentation and also with our report that will be posted on our website. And we'll talk a little bit about what the THEP is doing, including our most recent work, human health, and some of our key tips. So this question about metals or contamination in food is not specific to trail. Many people have probably heard about mercury levels in fish or arsenic in rice, and there's lots of situations where contaminants get into food, and these are both human caused or naturally occurring. There's lots of research on this across the planet as humans need to grow food in the soil, and we look to a lot of other research and literature and studies that have been done all over the planet on when we're looking at the trail work. We look at things related to plant uptake and how they different plants handle metals. We look at soil amendments. We also look at risk factors about consumption rates and how metals are absorbed in the body. So we look at a whole bunch of different factors when we're considering the garden produce studies in trail, and based on work that's being done all over the planet. More relevant to us is our local studies, where we look specifically at lead in produce, and this has been going on in the trail area through the lead task force years, and more recently, since I started on the program in 2008, we've been testing produce periodically from people's gardens. And we most recently did a study in 2019 where we went back and looked at a bunch of gardens and garden produce in trail. So we have air where lead in air would land on produce. It can be then absorbed into the plant. It also lands on produce in the form of dust, which could be washed off. We have soil that might have lead in it, and the soil can stick to the plant roots, and it also can be taken up into the plant. So when soil metals are dissolved into water, they can be taken up into the roots of the plant. We have water, which if water is contaminated and it's a source of lead, it would then contribute to lead in the soil, but also that dissolved metals that would come into the plant or onto the plant. And the produce types. So different types of produce respond differently to nutrients. They respond differently to metals. They respond differently to all types of conditions. So the produce type is affected by, or how much lead in the produce is affected by the produce type. So these are all correct answers. I'm not going to go into water today, simply because we don't feel it's a significant source of lead in trail. We have tested water, residential tap water, and we haven't found it above the guidelines. So we'll talk about the air, soil, and produce types a little bit further. So specific to some of our studies that we've done in trail, the first one is soil. So I mentioned that soil can adhere to the roots and also be taken up into the roots. That lead that might be attached to those soil particles. Our soil lead, we obviously see the soil lead more closely related to the root crops, so lead in root crops. Obviously that makes sense since they're in direct contact with it. And we also see that amending soil can help reduce lead uptake, specifically with roots. So having a more neutral soil, soil pH, and also phosphorus amendments can help reduce the uptake of the root vegetable specifically. I think that the key points are about soil is that we actually don't see soil as the primary factor affecting lead in produce and trail. We obviously see that the soil lead is lower, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the produce lead is lower. So this year we had resampled gardens that had previous soil replacement, and we resampled gardens that had recent soil replacement, and we did not see that there was a significant decrease in lead between remediation, lead in the produce before and after remediation. It's not the primary factor, but remediation is still an important part of the puzzle, specifically when it comes to direct contact with soil. So obviously, if you're gardening, you're touching the soil. And here's a lovely photo of one of our families where, of course, we want to get families involved in gardening. And when you have young children playing in the dirt, that dirt sometimes ends up in their mouths. And so it definitely helps on the direct soil contact, but not specifically with reducing the produce lead. So moving on to air quality. Air quality is a very important part of lowering soil or produce lead. So as I mentioned in our first slide about produce, the air lands on the plants. The lead in the air can also be absorbed into the leaves. And this graph that I've popped up here shows some of the produce samples that were taken in the period between 2007 and 2013 in the blue, and in 2019 in the green. You'll also note that there's a few different little comparative criteria. These are from the World Health Organization, and they show some of the recommended limits for lead in different produce types. So you can see for our first one, the berries. So berries before the in our earlier studies and then after were much lower, and in fact lower than the recommended guidelines. We see a drop as well in fruit crops and again in leafies. We don't see as much of a change in our root vegetables. Obviously, they're not as exposed to air. So what's important about this is that in 2012, the Fugitive Dust Reduction Program started and air quality improved in trail. Now, the more substantial parts of the Fugitive Dust Reduction Program came into play in the later years, but prior to 2019 and prior to this sampling. So it's quite remarkable that we've seen this significant drop in our berries, our fruiting crops, and our leafies, and understandable why we're not seeing as much of a drop in the root crops. The other piece is that washing produce does help lower the lead. We wash all of our produce when we're sampling, and we also recommend that home gardeners wash their produce. And I will proceed to the next slide. If there's any more questions. The last one is produce types. So again, it is a log scale, so it's not directly comparable between one another. However, it helps present an idea that we see in the different produce types in the community. And yeah, so different crops take up lead differently, whether it's from the soil, the water, or air. And what we see typically is that our fruiting crops take up the least amount, and our berries a little bit more, but less. And our leafies and our rooting crops take up the most. One of the when we sample people's yards and gardens and trail, the fruit crops are also often the most highly grown and consumed. It's a nice climate for growing tomatoes and cucumbers and things like that. And we also see that people often store those for long periods of time and eat them through the winter months. So that's good news, since it's since fruiting crops are the more common types of crops that we grow. The blue are the 2019 data from trail yards and gardens, and then the pink is commercial produce. So during our study in 2019, we also collected samples of commercial produce from grocery stores and things grown elsewhere around the world. And we do see metals in commercial produce. So just an idea, we didn't actually collect any berry samples during the study, but you can see in our fruit and our leafy and our root were tested for metals, and we found lead at these rates. Of interest is our leafies. They typically have the highest lead, but by weight, so you think about a tomato or a potato and the weight of those and how many cups of leafy greens you'd need to eat. So although they are higher than other crops, they are consumed less typically than some of the heavier fruiting and root crops. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind when you're looking at the lead in the different types of produce. And then for root crops, we noticed some variation just within root crops, where we did see some crops tended to have higher metals, such as carrots and beets, and some of the other crops had, like potatoes or the tuber type root crops, had typically lower metals. And this is supported in the literature, although our sample size was quite small. We only had 4 potatoes in our study. It was an interesting finding and supported by the literature. All right, so that's kind of a summary of our latest work. And now I'll just move on to some of the key points about produce in trail. So a lot of people wonder, well, what does this really mean to me? And, you know, are there concerns with growing produce in trail? So with adults, we don't see a concern, as we typically see with a lot of the lead exposure pathway in trail. So in children, there are some potential risks. I've provided an example of our exposure pathways diagram, which shows all the different ways that children could be exposed to lead. And same as in produce, is that there's several different ways, but mostly it's that direct soil contact. So that hand to mouth activity that could be associated with dirty hands after playing in the garden. And the other finding is that produce could contribute to child exposure. So if a child were to be eating significant amounts of produce, certain types of produce for an extended period of time, as in several months, then there could be some increases to their lead exposure. So we did have consistent findings across all of our studies, including with some of the literature. So the older studies done in trail found the same key messages, that soil remediation alone does not significantly reduce lead in produce. We found that different produce types take up lead differently. Commercial produce typically has lower lead than homegrown produce. And there's key ways to minimize lead exposure. So washing crops, washing all your produce, peeling root crops, having your soil tested so you can be informed about that, and washing your hands after working in the garden. Our recent data for new findings lead in fruit and leafy produce were significantly lower than in previous studies. And in fact, many of them were lower than those guidelines that I had shown on the previous slide. We see this lead reduction in fruit and leafy produce closely related to improved air quality. So that's great news because it's one of our key messages about dust, and it's our focal point of a lot of this work. So I found it interesting to see such a close link, and it's part of the same goal. And we also saw some roots were consistently higher than others. So even within those different produce types, we did see some trends, but nothing that is too significant because of our sample size. However, we did look to the literature to support that and had the same findings. So we have a bunch of tips and messages that we give out to homeowners in trail. We always recommend washing fruits and vegetables. We recommend peeling your root crops. We think about choosing what you grow. So fruit crops have the lowest lead. So if you're considering gardening and you are concerned about lead, fruit crops are the lowest. Have your soil tested and amend your soil if needed. Wash your hands, and of course, wash your children's hands after working in the garden. And I just want to end with some kind of highlights of my experience in trails. So, and my life experience. So I think that there are many health benefits of growing your own food and being connected to the food supply. So there's lots of great health benefits to getting outside and growing and watching your garden grow. And people have been gardening in trail for over 100 years. So I don't know how many gardens I've tested and seen in the community, but repeatedly I meet with people who have been gardening here for 60, 80 years, and they're amazing gardeners and very healthy people. So just wanted to what we see and what we with the benefits for gardening is, I think, very evident in a lot of the people in trail. And lead in produce in trails lower than it's ever been. So the results from our 2019 study and improved air quality that tech is continually working on, we believe that these results would continue to be lower.